I raised my stepdaughter for 15 years, then she thanked her dad's mistress at her birthday dinner instead of me. I gave up everything for that girl, her lunches, her nightmares, her childhood. Then she stood beside the woman who broke our home, and called her family. Now, I'm gone, and they're the ones left behind. I met James when I was 40 and he was 42, at a friend's housewarming party on a rainy Saturday in early spring. He showed up late, looking exhausted, with his daughter Ellie clutching his leg like it was the only stable thing in her life. She was this shy, quiet little girl about 7 years old, with big brown eyes that barely looked up at anyone. James looked worn down but tried to keep a smile on his face as he introduced himself. He mentioned his wife had passed away 2 years earlier, and that it had been tough trying to raise Ellie while working full-time in construction. I could see he was doing his best, but the strain was all over his face. I had brought a tray of homemade lemon bars to the party and noticed Ellie glancing at them when she thought no one was watching. So I crouched down, offered her one and said, "These have magic sugar dust on top. Makes you invisible for 5 seconds if you eat it slow enough." She didn't laugh, but she reached out, took one and gave me the tiniest smile. That was the first time I saw her walls come down even just a little. After that party, James asked for my number. Our first date was at a kid-friendly diner with a jukebox and paper placemats for coloring, and to my surprise, Ellie came along. At the time, I thought it was strange bringing your child to a first date, but now I understand he wasn't just testing me, he was watching to see how I would interact with the most important person in his life. I leaned into it, helping Ellie color the ducks on her placemat while James looked on, quietly grateful. She didn't talk much, but she paid attention. I remember her asking me softly if I liked cats. When I said I did, she nodded like she had just filed that information away somewhere important. Over the next few months, we had more outings as a trio than just the two of us. James invited me to her school play, a local soccer game she was nervous about, and even to a parent-teacher conference. I didn't mind at all. I'd always wanted children, and there was something about Ellie's serious little face lighting up when she saw me that made me feel like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. 6 months in, James asked if I'd consider moving in. His place wasn't big. 2 bedrooms, a modest kitchen, a backyard that needed work, but it felt like home the moment I stepped inside. I ended my lease and left my job as a middle school English teacher, something I loved but couldn't manage anymore. The school was over an hour away, and Ellie needed someone present. Someone who could be there for her at drop-off, pick-up, sick days, and bedtime. I picked up part-time tutoring work instead, which paid less but gave me flexibility. Meanwhile, James worked long hours, often gone before sunrise and back after dark. That left me to pack Ellie's lunch every day, slipping silly notes inside with doodles and puns. I quizzed her on spelling words and multiplication, wiped her tears during stomach bugs, and sat through every choir recital with a camera in one hand and tissues in the other. I taught her how to braid her hair before school, and gave her pep talks about standing up to girls who weren't so kind. Slowly, she started calling me Mom. First on accident, then on purpose. The first time she said it, I was brushing her hair and she mumbled it under her breath. I froze for a second, unsure how James would take it. But when I told him later, he just smiled and said, "I'm glad she found someone to fill that space." When Ellie was 9, James and I got married in our backyard under strings of fairy lights and a white canopy we borrowed from a neighbor. It was a simple ceremony, just close friends and family, and Ellie wore a white flower crown as our flower girl. She stood up before the first toast and proudly told everyone she was finally getting a real mom. My own parents, who had been hesitant about me marrying a man with a kid, warmed up when they saw how close we were. From that point on, Ellie wasn't just someone I cared about, she was my daughter in every sense that mattered. I poured everything I had into raising her, not to replace her mother, but to give her the love and steadiness a child needs to grow. We visited her mother's grave every year on her birthday, and I encouraged Ellie to keep a journal where she could write down things she wished she could tell her mom. That journal became one of our rituals, something she treasured deeply. For the next 15 years, my world revolved around this family we had built, James, Ellie, and me. I didn't miss my old job, not really. I missed parts of it, the kids, the satisfaction of teaching, but I knew I was doing something just as meaningful. I was shaping a young life, watching Ellie grow from a timid girl to a bright, confident teenager. There were late-night talks, broken hearts, science projects, and messy birthday parties. I never expected thanks. I just wanted her to feel safe, loved, and supported. And for the longest time I believed she did. Moving in with James and Ellie wasn't just about sharing a roof. It was stepping into a life already in progress and trying to make space for myself in it. First, everything was a learning curve. Ellie had her own routines, her own quirks, and a quiet way of testing whether I was going to stick around. She'd watch me from across the room like she was taking mental notes, and I'd do my best to show up for her every single day. From packing lunches with little jokes to helping her pick out outfits for school picture day, I tried to make her feel like she was never alone in the world. The house was small, nothing fancy, but it was cozy. We made it work. James snored like a freight train. Ellie hogged the bathroom with her hair routine by the time she turned 11, and I constantly had laundry going. But it felt like home. There were spaghetti nights with sauce-stained t-shirts, rainy Sundays filled with puzzles and hot cocoa, and Friday evenings when Ellie and I would bake cookies while waiting for James to come home. She started calling me Mom more regularly, not just in private but in front of her friends, teachers, and anyone who asked. And each time she said it, I felt both proud and protective, like I was being trusted with something sacred. When James proposed, it wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was a quiet moment over takeout after Ellie had gone to bed. He said he couldn't imagine his life without me, and asked if I wanted to make it official. I said yes without hesitation. We planned a small wedding in our backyard the following summer, with white folding chairs, fairy lights strung between trees, and Ellie walking down the aisle in a light blue dress holding a bouquet of daisies. She stood with us at the altar, grinning from ear to ear, and whispered to me right before the vows, "Now we're really a family." After the wedding, nothing big changed on the surface, but it felt different. It was as if this invisible thread between us had been tied tighter. My days revolved around Ellie, packing lunches, driving to school, helping with homework, comforting her after hard days. James still worked long hours, often gone before sunrise and home after dinner. The emotional weight of parenting landed mostly on me, and I embraced it. I felt needed. I felt like I had a purpose bigger than myself. I gave up more than just a job when I left teaching. I gave up a piece of my identity, but it didn't feel like a loss at the time. Felt like a trade. I wasn't standing in front of a classroom anymore, but I was still teaching how to be kind, how to be strong, how to solve a problem without breaking down. I showed up for every school play, every awkward parent-teacher conference, every field trip that needed a volunteer. I was the one who taught Ellie how to ride a bike, how to manage her first crush, how to find her voice when someone tried to dim it. When Ellie turned 11, we made the adoption official. She was the one who asked. We were in the kitchen one morning, and she just looked up from her cereal and said, "Can I be your daughter on paper too?" I nearly dropped the bowl I was holding. We went through the paperwork, met with the lawyer, and I signed the documents with my hands shaking. That day, when the judge said I was legally her mother, Ellie squeezed my hand so tightly I thought my fingers might bruise. From then on, I wasn't just someone who had stepped into her life. I was someone who belonged in it. I never tried to erase her birth mother. We kept her memory alive in ways that honored both the past and the present. Every year on her mom's birthday, we visited the cemetery together. Ellie would bring a small letter or drawing, and I'd stand quietly beside her while she talked to the stone. I never interrupted, never made it about me. I just held her hand afterward and told her that her mom would be proud. Over time, people stopped calling me her stepmom. Even Ellie's teachers and doctors referred to me as her mother without thinking twice. And honestly, that was all I ever wanted, to be there, to be counted, to be part of the foundation she was building her life on. We weren't just a patched-together household anymore. We were a real family. We had our fights, our growing pains, and our chaotic days, but underneath all of it was love. Real, unconditional love. And I thought, maybe naively, that nothing could ever shake that. When Ellie started preparing for college, the house felt like it was holding its breath. She had grown into this sharp, curious young woman with a head full of ideas and a heart full of ambition, and I couldn't have been more proud. I took it upon myself to help her navigate the overwhelming world of college applications, reviewing essays, researching scholarships late into the night, driving her to campus tours when James's work schedule didn't allow him to join. I never complained. I knew what it meant to her. And I figured James appreciated it too, even if he didn't say much. He always seemed tired, always somewhere else in his mind. The truth is, I started noticing the distance between us long before the birthday dinner. It was never explosive, never loud. Just a slow, steady silence that crept into the corners of our home. James started spending more time at work, sometimes leaving before sunrise and getting home long after dinner. When we did have time together, he was distant, glued to his phone or zoning out during conversations. I chalked it up to stress. Construction work was grueling, and I thought maybe he was just burned out. He still kissed me goodnight, still smiled when Ellie showed him her latest art project. But it felt like the warmth behind those gestures had thinned. Ellie's second year of college came and went, and when she decided to take a gap year to find herself, I supported her without hesitation. James didn't understand it, he saw it as a detour, a delay. But I saw a young woman trying to figure out who she was without the constant pressure of grades and deadlines. I helped her find a part-time job at a boutique downtown, encouraged her to pick up painting again, and made sure she had room to breathe. She seemed happy, settled. I thought I had done something right. For her 22nd birthday, I wanted everything to be perfect. She had always talked about this upscale Italian restaurant with a view of the city's skyline, so I booked a private room weeks in advance. I called in favors, worked out a custom menu with the chef, and ordered a cake with an edible image of Ellie as a little girl grinning in a princess dress. I even found a delicate silver bracelet engraved with her birth date and a simple message, "To my daughter, with love always." I wrapped it in her favorite teal paper and wrote a long handwritten card telling her how proud I was of the woman she'd become. James seemed a little too eager about the event. He insisted on inviting some of his co-workers, which I thought was odd given that it was a family occasion. But I let it go. Maybe he just wanted to show off Ellie to the people at work. I didn't question it, just added a few extra seats to the reservation and made sure there was enough wine and dessert to go around. On the night of the dinner, I got there early to set everything up. I double-checked the place cards, went over the dessert menu with the chef again, and made sure Ellie's bracelet was placed neatly beside her plate. I wore the blue dress she had helped me pick out a few weeks earlier, something simple but elegant. When James and Ellie arrived, she hugged me briefly but seemed distracted, checking her phone every few minutes. James was the same, fidgety, scanning the room like he was waiting for someone. And then she walked in, Laura. A woman I'd never met before, dressed to turn heads in a deep red dress that hugged every curve. She made a beeline for James the moment she entered. The way she laughed at everything he said, the way she touched his arm without hesitation, it was like she didn't care who noticed. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe they were just friendly co-workers. Maybe she was just outgoing. Still, something felt off. James had rearranged the seating when they arrived, claiming it would make for better conversation, but somehow he ended up beside Laura and across from Ellie while I was at the other end with my sister. As the dinner went on, I couldn't stop watching the three of them. The inside jokes, the shared glances, the casual touches, it didn't feel like friendship. It felt rehearsed. Familiar. I tried to focus on the guests around me, but it was like I was watching a scene unfold from the outside, unable to look away. When the cake finally came out, I stood up to say a few words. I kept it short, sweet. Talked about the first time I met Ellie, how proud I was of her, how much I loved her. I was holding back tears, but I kept my voice steady. James glanced at his watch halfway through, and Ellie smiled politely, but something about her expression seemed strained. I didn't dwell on it. I sat down, feeling like I had done my part. Then Ellie stood up. She thanked her friends for coming, thanked her dad for always supporting her. And just as I was waiting for her to mention me, to maybe say something about the woman who raised her, she turned to Laura with a smile and said, "And I want to thank Laura for making my dad happy these last 8 months. It's so nice to see him smile again." The room fell dead silent. Forks hovered in midair. Laura looked down at her plate with a soft, pleased smile. James turned a shade of red I had never seen on his face before. I looked around in disbelief, then back at Ellie, who just kept going. She talked about how happy she was that they didn't have to keep it a secret anymore. That Laura had been like a friend to her. That it was time to stop pretending. I didn't say a word. I just stood up, grabbed my purse, and walked out. Behind me, I could hear whispers, someone calling my name, chairs scraping back from the table. But I didn't look back. I couldn't. The woman who had spent 15 years raising a child, giving up everything to build this family, had just been erased from her own daughter's birthday dinner like she was never there at all. I walked out of that restaurant like I was underwater, every sound muffled, every movement slow, like my body was trying to catch up with what my heart already knew. My hands were shaking as I reached into my purse for my car keys. I couldn't breathe. I could still hear Ellie's voice in my head, thanking Laura, not me, not the woman who raised her, but the woman who had been sleeping with her father, for making him happy. 8 months. 8 months this had been going on, and I was the last to know. I heard footsteps behind me, fast ones, and then James's voice shouting my name like it meant something. He caught up as I was unlocking the door, grabbing my arm like he had any right to stop me. "Let me explain," he said, trying to keep his voice low even though his face was flushed and his hands trembled. "This isn't how I wanted you to find out." "How long?" I asked, pulling my arm away. I didn't need details. I just needed to hear him say it out loud. "It doesn't matter," he replied, rubbing the back of his neck like he was the one who had been hurt. "Things between us haven't been right for a long time. You had to feel it too." 8 months, I said, my voice flat. "That's what our daughter said." "Our daughter, who you turned against me." James looked like he'd been slapped, but he didn't deny it. He just sighed and muttered something about how things just happened. He told me he and Laura had worked together on a project, spent long hours talking, and one day it turned into something more. He claimed he hadn't meant to fall for her, that he didn't know how to tell me because he didn't want to hurt me. But then he said Laura understood him in a way I never did. That was the moment the weight of it all settled on my chest. 15 years. I gave up my job, my independence, my entire adult life to help him raise his daughter. And now I was being told I was never enough. "She gets me," he said, like he was talking about a friend instead of the woman he'd wrecked our home for. Ellie saw how happy I was and she understood. "I was going to tell you, after her birthday." "After her birthday?" I said, blinking. "After the party I planned? The cake I ordered? The bracelet I wrapped? You were just going to what? Drop it on me like bad weather?" He didn't have an answer. He just stood there looking pathetic and caught. Finally, he said, "You've been a good stepmother to Ellie. I'll always appreciate that. But Laura and we connect on a different level. She's more in line with what I want for my future." That was it for me. I got into the car without another word and drove straight to my sister's house. I didn't even bother grabbing Ellie's gift from the trunk. My sister came home an hour later with my coat and told me that most people had left the dinner early, whispering awkward goodbyes, avoiding eye contact. The night had crumbled the minute I walked out. The next day, I went back to the house while James was at work. I moved through it like a ghost, gathering only the essentials, my clothes, my personal documents, a few photo albums, and things too sentimental to leave behind. I noticed Laura's belongings already in our bedroom. A hairbrush on my dresser. A pair of shoes in my closet. I left my wedding ring on the kitchen counter beside a note that simply read, "I'll be filing for divorce." I didn't mention Ellie. I didn't have the words. Over the next couple of weeks, I stayed with my sister while looking for a small apartment. I took a leave of absence from my tutoring job. I couldn't focus on anything, couldn't teach when my mind was cracked open. James started texting nonstop. First apologizing, then blaming me. He said I had become cold, distant, more focused on Ellie than on him. That I didn't support his career. That he'd felt alone for years. Each message chipped away at whatever sliver of understanding I had left. He wanted me to believe his betrayal was somehow my fault. I ignored most of it and handled everything through my lawyer. After one particularly nasty voicemail where he called me frigid and cruel, I blocked his number. Then Ellie started calling. Her first message was an apology. She said she didn't mean to hurt me, that she was just trying to support her dad's happiness. In another message, she said Laura had confided in her months ago about her feelings for James and made Ellie feel special by trusting her with the secret. She sounded unsure, a little defensive. "These things happen in families all the time," she said. "But they don't. Not like this. Not with a daughter helping her father betray the woman who raised her." I didn't respond to any of her messages. I couldn't. I couldn't square the little girl who used to run into my arms with the young woman who had stood at her birthday dinner and smiled while I was erased from her life. That was the part that cut the deepest. Not James's betrayal, but Ellie's. The girl I taught how to ride a bike. The girl who cried into my shoulder after her first breakup. The girl who once called me Mom in front of a crowded auditorium. She knew. She knew the entire time. And she said nothing. Worse, she chose to keep it a secret. To help them lie. To help them hide. 15 years. And I was nothing more than a placeholder. Disposable. Replaceable. And now I had to figure out how to move forward without either of them. Because whatever we once had, whatever we built together, it was already gone. Burned down with no one left to save it. Leaving the house felt like peeling off a layer of my own skin. Every room held memories, Ellie's birthday streamers still tucked in the back of a drawer, the family photos on the hallway wall, the corner of the kitchen where I taught her how to stir without splashing. But I couldn't stay. Not after what had been done. I took only what I needed: clothes, documents, a few keepsakes that didn't make my chest tighten when I looked at them. The rest I left behind, including the wedding ring, which I placed gently on the kitchen counter next to a folded note for James. It was short, simple, and final: I'll be filing for divorce. I couldn't bring myself to write Ellie's name. I didn't know how to explain what I felt. My sister helped me get settled in her guest room while I looked for a place of my own. I took a leave from my tutoring job. Every time I sat down to prepare lessons, my thoughts drifted to the dinner, the speech, the betrayal. James tried to contact me constantly in those early days, switching between guilt and blame like a man throwing darts in the dark. He'd start with an apology, saying he never meant for things to go that way, then shift into accusation, claiming I had changed, that I didn't make him feel seen anymore, that I'd invested too much in Ellie and not enough in him. As if love had been a ledger and I had given too much to the wrong column. Eventually, after one voicemail where he called me cold and frigid, I blocked his number entirely. Then came Ellie. Her voice trembled in the first few messages, apologizing, telling me she didn't mean to hurt me. She said she was trying to support her dad's happiness, that Laura made him laugh again. She admitted Laura had told her about the relationship months before, and Ellie had kept it secret because she didn't want to be the one to stand in their way. In later messages, her tone changed, a less sorrowful, more defensive. "You're overreacting," she said. "These things happen. Families go through changes." But nothing about this felt like change. It felt like betrayal with a smile. 3 weeks after I left, I received a message from an unknown number. "Please, I need to talk to you. It's urgent." It was Ellie texting from a friend's phone. Against my better judgment, and my sister's firm advice, I agreed to meet her the next day at a small diner not far from my new apartment. When I walked in, I almost didn't recognize her. The girl who had always kept her hair brushed and her clothes crisp looked like she'd been living in someone else's storm. Her hair was unwashed and pulled back messily, her eyes shadowed with fatigue, clothes wrinkled and thrown together. She was tearing up a napkin between her fingers, and when she saw me, she broke down crying. I sat across from her, keeping my distance emotionally even though every instinct in me wanted to reach across the table and hug her like I used to. I ordered a coffee I didn't want just to buy her a moment to compose herself. She talked in broken sentences, between sobs and deep breaths. She told me Laura had moved into the house just days after I left. She'd taken over the master bedroom, replaced family photos with her own artwork, and even started remodeling the living room without asking. 2 weeks in, during what was supposed to be a quiet family dinner, Laura announced she was pregnant. According to Ellie, James looked stunned at first but quickly recovered, raising a toast to new beginnings. Later that night, he pulled Ellie aside and told her they were turning her bedroom into a nursery. If she wanted to stay, she could move into the guest room in the basement. Ellie objected, saying the basement had barely any windows and that it wasn't fair to be pushed out of the room she had called her own since she was a child. James responded coldly, telling her she was an adult now and needed to start making space for the new family. He reminded her that she had supported him and Laura from the beginning and questioned why she was being difficult now. He accused her of being selfish, told her Laura needed a calm environment during the pregnancy and that Ellie's attitude was toxic. The next day, Ellie packed a few things and moved in with a friend, thinking it would be temporary. But her part-time retail job wasn't enough to afford rent, and she had already missed too many shifts dealing with the chaos. When she went back to work, her manager told her she'd been replaced. Now she had no income, nowhere stable to live, and friends who were growing impatient with her couch surfing. "I've been applying for jobs," she whispered. "But every time I get an interview, I break down. I can't focus. I can't sleep. I don't know what to do." I stared at her as she cried, this young woman who I had once cradled during fevers and comforted after nightmares. And I asked her as calmly as I could, "Did you know the entire time?" She nodded slowly, not looking up. "Laura told me first," she said. "She came into the store one day and bought me lunch. Told me they had feelings for each other and she wanted my blessing before they got serious. She made it sound romantic, like Dad had waited his whole life for real happiness and you were just someone he needed for a while." She admitted that Laura had showered her with gifts, taken her shopping, and made her feel like part of something special. Ellie had helped them plan their meetups, lied to me about where James was, even deleted texts from his phone when he left it unattended. Once she faked a crisis with a college assignment so I'd be too distracted to notice James had slipped away for a weekend with Laura. Laura said you'd understand eventually, Ellie muttered. She said lots of families go through transitions like this. That someday we'd all be friends. I took a deep breath and reminded her of everything I'd given up. My job, my independence, 15 years of my life. I told her how I'd sat through every school play, every flu, every bad grade. How I'd been the one to teach her how to drive while James said he didn't have the patience. I listed off the small moments, the big ones, the invisible work of motherhood she never saw. And with every word she sobbed harder. And how did you repay me? I asked, my voice cold. You lied to me. You sat across from me every night while helping your father cheat. You smiled at me while knowing everything. You helped erase me from a life I built with everything I had. Ellie couldn't speak. Just shook her head and whispered, I'm sorry. I didn't know it would end like this. I thought they were happy. I thought it would work out. Then she looked up, panicked. But where am I supposed to go? I have nowhere to live. No job. Dad won't return my calls. Laura changed the locks. I tried to go back yesterday and they wouldn't let me in. I stood up, slid a 20 under the untouched coffee, and said, You made your choice 8 months ago. You don't get to ask me for help now. She reached out as I walked toward the door, her voice cracking. Please. You're the only mom I've ever really had. I paused with my hand on the handle. For a second, I saw her as that little girl again, the one who used to cling to my leg during thunderstorms. But then I remembered her face at the birthday dinner, how she looked at Laura like I was just some extra in a story that didn't matter anymore. And I opened the door without looking back. 2 days after I walked out of that diner, I blocked Ellie's number. I shut down every line of communication she could use, her social media, her email, even the mutual friends I thought she might use to reach me. I didn't do it out of cruelty. I did it because I had nothing left to give. Every part of me had been wrung out, and what remained needed silence. My sister told me later that Ellie had posted on social media about being homeless, about being betrayed by her family. She made vague statements about making mistakes, about being pushed out, about having nowhere to go. It painted her as a victim of circumstances, of a broken family she didn't ask for. And people believed her. I started getting calls from relatives who hadn't reached out in years, lecturing me about forgiveness, reminding me that I'd raised Ellie for 15 years, that she was still young, that she had made a mistake. They told me she needed me, that I should be the bigger person. And part of me, some hollow, tired part, still wanted to believe I could be that person. But I also couldn't forget that this wasn't just a moment of poor judgment. Ellie hadn't just kept a secret, she participated in it. She helped shape it. She erased me from her heart long before I ever walked away. The divorce dragged on in those early weeks. James wanted to keep the house, citing Laura's pregnancy, and offered me a settlement that was laughably low. My lawyer was sharp and firm, reminding me over and over that I had legal rights, that I didn't need to accept scraps after building a life someone else had burned down. I refused James's offer. Then something shifted. A mutual acquaintance mentioned that Ellie was staying with one of James's relatives, someone who had seen her social media posts and reached out. I took no pleasure in knowing she was safe, but I did feel relief. Not for her, but for myself. I could close that door fully, at least for now. 2 weeks later, I got a letter in the mail. Handwritten. No return address. The handwriting on the envelope told me everything before I even opened it. It was from Ellie. She didn't ask for anything. Not money, not shelter, not forgiveness. She wrote about Laura, about how she had worked her way into their lives slowly, presenting herself as a friend, a confidant. She admitted that Laura had filled her head with half-truths, told her I didn't understand James, that I was holding him back, that I was only a temporary figure in their lives. Ellie said she believed her because she wanted to believe in the fantasy, that James deserved happiness, that things would somehow work out. She wrote that she didn't expect me to forgive her. She just wanted me to know she finally understood the depth of what she had done, that she saw now how she had been used, how her loyalty had been manipulated. She ended the letter with, You may never speak to me again, and I understand. But I needed you to know that I am so sorry. I didn't respond right away. I let the letter sit on the table beside my bed for days. I wasn't sure what to feel. I wanted to believe she meant every word. But I also knew trust, once broken that completely, doesn't come back just because someone says they're sorry. A week after that, my lawyer told me James had come back to the table with a new settlement offer. Much more reasonable, finally fair. It wasn't hard to guess why. He didn't want Laura dragged into depositions. He wanted things clean. He wanted out. I signed the paperwork, finally closing the legal chapter of my marriage. Then, unexpectedly, a second letter arrived. Shorter than the first, more focused. Ellie said she'd found a roommate and a small apartment across town. She had a new job lined up, something steady. She wasn't asking to come back into my life, but she hoped one day that she could earn back some part of my trust. I met her for lunch. Not because I was ready, but because I owed it to myself to see if anything remained of the girl I once raised. She looked better, tired but stable. She didn't cry this time. She didn't plead. She apologized again, but this time it wasn't performative. It was quiet. Honest. She said, "I know I can't undo what I did. I just want you to know that I see it now. All of it. And I hate who I was in that moment." I didn't offer forgiveness. Not right away. I told her I needed time. That trust wasn't something I could give just because I missed her. But I did give her the number of a therapist who might help her make sense of everything she'd been through, and everything she had caused. That night I went home to my small apartment with its mismatched furniture and quiet evenings, and for the first time, I felt like I could breathe. Not because everything was healed, but because I had stopped waiting for someone else to fix it. I was rebuilding. I was learning to live without the version of family I once fought so hard to protect. People ask me if I regret walking out of that birthday dinner without confronting them, without throwing a drink, without making a scene. And the answer is no. Because I walked out with something far more powerful than vengeance. I walked out with my dignity. And when I look back now, I can see it clearly. Anything built on lies will eventually fall. James and Laura's perfect fantasy crumbled in weeks. Ellie lost the version of her father she thought she understood. And I'm still standing. Bruised, yes. Changed, absolutely. But I'm still here. And I'm finally living for me.